Minister, you are aware that recently I moved legislation to amend the Residential Institutions Statutory Fund. The fund charged with assisting and, I suppose, administering some sort of redress to the people who had experienced abuse in residential institutions. And subsequent to that, there was an explosion in the media, particularly on the radio airwaves, concerning some of these issues when the CEO of the Caranua scheme, Mary Higgins, addressed some of those concerns by survivors in the most derogatory manner possible and actually succeeded in adding to the victimisation and the trauma experienced by already traumatised people, because the narrative put forward by the CEO of Caranua was one where survivors of institutional abuse were called "these people," "they will never be happy," and terms such as that, which are highly inappropriate, a distortion of the truth, and actually an unashamed attempt by her to pass the blame for the failings of Caranua onto the very victims and survivors themselves. And I think the lack of empathy and the derogatory characterisation is actually proof of what those survivors have been saying, is that the Caranua process has actually served, rather than helping them, has served to re-victimise them. Now, during the debate on my bill, the mismanagement of the scheme was highlighted by deputies from all sides of the Houses, and it's clear from representations that all of us would get in our offices from applicants, actually from the appeals officer's annual report itself, that there are hundreds, if not thousands, of applicants who have been affected by delays, by arbitrary cut-offs, by an inconsistent approach from advisers, and actually by rudeness in many instances. People have been told, for example, this isn't a sweet shop. One complainant who got onto my office said when she issued a quote for replacement windows, she was told by the Caranua staff member that he could have had a 6-bedroomed house done for that amount of money, and he was going to have to go and seriously get that checked out. And the woman said she felt like her word was being questioned, that he was making her out to be a liar, that she'd waited all that time to even make the application, and to be treated like that was really hard to take. And when survivors brought those stories onto the airwaves, the CEO of Caranua actually dismissed them. But we know that what the survivors are saying are true, because of what they've said to us and because of the way our offices have been treated when we've had to try and make representations. And I suppose what I'm asking you today, Minister, is, do you think it's satisfactory for the person who's the public face of Caranua to speak about people like that? And what action have you taken to address the situation? Because I don't believe it's acceptable for anybody to behave like that, but for somebody who actually got a €10,000 pay increase from the very fund she's supposed to be administering, bringing her salary up to over €87,000 per annum, and to still express views like that is absolutely reprehensible as far as I'm concerned. And clearly what we have here is the sort of continuation of the hardline approach being adopted by the state to survivors, which has been evident in the Magdalen laundries, the exclusion of the Bethany homes from the mother and baby home inquiries, and I don't think it's acceptable, Minister, for you or other members of the government to allow those comments to go unchecked. I think because if you don't challenge that, then you're only furthering and adding to the damage.
First of all, I'd like to thank Deputy Clare Daly for raising this issue. I know she has been a very consistent pursuing of these issues. As she knows, Caranua is an independent body. It's established under legislation. It has certain purposes and functions that it has to execute. It's funded not by the Exchequer but by a contribution from the religious orders, and it has a sum of 110 million to distribute. At this stage, there are over 5,500 applicants have been made, and payment, I think around 55% of the fund has been disbursed at this stage to approximately 4,200 applicants. Those applicants are people who were made awards under the redress scheme. I think the Deputy is right. There have been a number of public criticisms of Caranua aired in the media by survivors of abuse. And I myself have met with some of the survivors, and I'm very conscious of the concerns that they've raised about the administration of the fund. I think the CEO and the board have attempted to respond to those criticisms, and they have publicly acknowledged many difficulties that arose, particularly in the early period when the system was being set up. And I think a lot of difficulties were acknowledged as having occurred. I think last year additional procedures were changed to try and make things better. And as we've expressed here in the Dáil, I think it's the view of all sides in the House that it continues to be absolutely necessary that we continue to improve those procedures. I think it's vital that in all our dealings with people who have been the victims of appalling abuse at a time when the state stood by and didn't meet its responsibilities. We have to be sure that the systems are sensitive, fair and compassionate to those who were affected. I believe survivors must be dealt with in such a fashion. I think the comments made were unfortunate and could be misconstrued, and my belief is that the whole process has to be designed to serve the survivors. Now, I am very conscious that in meeting the obligations under the Act, there's purposes that have to be met. There are application procedures, there's accountability procedures to the PAC and all the rest of it. And also, of course, there are complaints procedures, appeal procedures, recourse to the Ombudsman designed to protect people. But I can well understand, and I know directly from speaking to people, that some of these procedures that from an administrative point of view may seem fair and necessary can seem very irksome to people who have suffered a sustained period of abuse and do, as the Deputy has described, can feel that these are obstacles being put in their way that are prolonging their suffering. I'm determined that we continue to improve the operation of Caranua. I think it is fair to say that many people have got good service from it. I mean, they handle thousands and thousands of applications, and there's no doubt that there has been good service, but there have been instances where people feel that that hasn't occurred. That's why not only were procedures changed last year, but we now have a review underway of the whole system, and I know that the Deputy is extremely anxious that there will be changes in the way that system works, and I will be examining her requests for quicker handling of cases, broadening the coverage and so on. In my belief is, we have to ensure we have still substantial sums there in the fund. We have to ensure that this system works fairly, but of course it still meets the standards that are set out in that legislation. So it is this balance that has to be struck. And as far as I'm concerned, my concern is to make sure that people are treated fairly and compassionately.
Well, I appreciate the Minister taking the topical issue, and I very much appreciate his comments in publicly acknowledging on the floor of the House the problems that exist with the scheme, and also his very clear utterances that any scheme that deals with the victims of abuse by the state, or while the state stood by, must be done in a sensitive, fair and compassionate manner, and I totally echo those points. And really what the Minister was saying, without saying it, was that the behaviour of the CEO and the utterances were not acceptable. You called them unfortunate and possibly that they could be misconstrued. Well, they were very unfortunate for the victims of abuse. They caused extreme hurt, and they are the exact scenario that you said you didn't want to see. They showed insensitivity, a lack of fairness and a total lack of compassion. And we have to spell that out here, and I think you could do it, because her comments couldn't have been misconstrued, as you said. They were what they said. In a radio interview, or actually in an interview in the Irish Times, Mary Higgins mentioned 19 suspected cases of fraud. Why throw something like that in? If there was fraud alleged, why didn't she go to the Gardaí? Sort of inferring that in an application process of thousands is a sort of an inference that everybody was out to scam the scheme. And yet, at the same time, residents or survivors feel very aggrieved by the fact that, say, Caranua, for example, retrospectively tried to impose actually a cap on the scheme for applicants who were never processed in the first place. So we want to talk about scams, let's talk about that one. I think what we need to see is the Minister to step in and ensure that Caranua does fulfil its obligations. I know you've said now that you're looking for submissions on the review to devise the terms of reference for the review. That seems to me like a review about a review which statutorily should have already been carried out a number of years ago. So it's beyond its sell-by date for that. I'm glad you've publicly acknowledged the problems in a roundabout sort of way in terms of the CEO. You were probably hard enough in some ways, but I think the message has to go out loud and clear. And I wonder if you could tell us, have you discussed the issue with her, or have you any plans to meet her in the foreseeable future?
Well, I can assure the Deputy that I will be meeting with the Board and obviously the Chairman in the context of the ongoing review. I think it's important that we use this review as an opportunity to make sure that we make the system as best as possibly we can. Now, I know that there will always be problems in the way any official body which has its obligations to meet criteria, to receive applications, to meet the obligations of the PAC and all the rest of it. And we have to try and design processes that are easier to use. And I know there have been frustrations around the appeal mechanisms, the complaint mechanisms. I think there's been few enough recourse to the Ombudsman, which obviously is a port of call. And I think it's right. We should try and make this as seamless as we can. I think, to be fair to Caranua, they have been doing very good work, and they have tried to improve their procedures consistently. They've sought to broaden their scope. I think the concept of putting a cap, I can understand how that came about. There was a concern that additional applications were coming and the cupboard would be effectively bare for some of the applications if the expenditure continued on some of the trends. Now, obviously, that can be considered in the course of this review as to whether that was an appropriate way to proceed. But what we're trying to do is to make sure that people are supported as best we can through this fund. There is legislation to be met, there are obligations to be met, and Caranua has to balance that, being very sensitive to the hurt that people have suffered and the obligations that we all have to those people. So hopefully we can, through this review, bring about a system that responds more effectively. And I think, to be fair, Caranua have been trying to progressively improve the system from a difficult start that I think everyone acknowledges.
We move on now to